Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's program, Imagining the Ancient Past, Navigating Scales of Time and Space in Human Evolution with Dr. Adam van Arsdale. Um, my name is Briana Pobiner, and I'm a paleoanthropologist with a slight cough today and educator at Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I'm a brown and gray-haired woman in a black shirt, wearing headphones in front of a Zoom screen with an African savanna photo with grass and an acacia tree behind me. Whether this is your first time joining us for the Hot Topic programs, our Human Origins Today series, or you've attended before, we're so glad to have you here. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. This discussion offers closed captioning. You can turn the captions on or off via the CC button, which should be located at the bottom of your Zoom interface. We're in a webinar format, so we can't see or hear you. As you have questions, please go ahead and submit those to the Q&A box, which is at the top or bottom of your screen. It looks like two speech bubbles, so we can sort through as many as possible. The Q&A time really flies by. The Q&A box is also where we will share any relevant links during the program, so keep an eye out there. So we'll start with a presentation by our speaker, Adam van Arsdale, and then I'll join him here to take your questions. During the presentation, I will also write answers to some of your questions, at least any that I can answer, as will another member of our behind the scenes team, Dr. Ryan McCrae. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Adam van Arsdale is a professor and currently department chair of anthropology at Wellesley College. He's a biological anthropologist with a specialization in paleoanthropology and is particularly interested in how we can, oops, I just lost my place, employ evolutionary theory to understand human biological variation by looking at patterns of variation in the human fossil record. He did fieldwork for more than a decade at the lower Paleolithic site of Dmanisi, Georgia. In recent years, his research has moved east to Kazakhstan, where he continues to explore questions around the dispersal, population structure, and ecogeographic constraints that operate on Paleolithic populations. He is currently conducting National Geographic funded exploratory work in south central Kazakhstan, attempting to identify new fossil and archaeological localities that might help us better understand the complex demographic structure of hominin populations in the Middle and Late Pleistocene. And now I will welcome Dr. Van Arsdale to share his presentation.
Thank you very much, Briana, and thank you everyone for attending today's event. It is a pleasure to speak with you all. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in so that we can have as much time as possible to talk. So over the last couple years, I've had the great pleasure of actually working with middle school teachers in my home state of Massachusetts, talking about changing curriculums around how we study the ancient past. And one of the questions that I've had the most fun talking with teachers about is how do we conceptualize the time span of human evolution? How do we conceptualize these huge sort of swaths of time, given our own understanding? So as Briana mentioned in my introduction, I worked for a long time at the lower Paleolithic site of Dmanisi, Georgia, a photo of which is sort of right here. It's a wonderful, beautiful site, sits in the middle of these medieval ruins as well. So it's this tremendous platform through which we can understand the ancient past. And the site itself dates back about 1.76 to 1.85 million years of age. Georgia, for those of you who aren't familiar, is part of the former Soviet Union in the Caucasus, situated here between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The site of Dmanisi itself is about 85 kilometers southwest of Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. And it's a remarkable site, a wonderful place to work, as these photos show, with really rich evidence of some of the earliest fossil ancestors outside of Africa dating to this time period, including specimens such as this individual. So a wonderful place to work to study and think about the ancient past and to think about human evolution. But one of the questions that I'd like to sort of begin with is, how do we conceptualize the time depth of 1.8 million years of age? If we sort of think of Dmanisi as going back about 1.8 billion years ago. That is an extraordinarily long period of time in some scales. If we think about the life of the planet itself, it's actually very, very recent. So how do we understand, and how especially do we ask evolutionary questions about human evolution given the time depths we're looking at? One of the places I like to sort of start thinking about that is just how do we experience time in our own lives? When I was a kid, I got to know my great grandmother, Graham Hilbert, pictured here, and she was an amazing woman in part because she lived to be 109 years old. She was born in 1885, died in 1994, which meant when I was talking to her, I was talking to someone whose experience spanned back long before my own lifetime, going back now almost 140 years ago into the past. In her life, her grandfather was born in the first decade of the 19th century. So if I think of sort of the window of time that my conversations with my great grandmother encompassed, it takes us back almost across 200 years, which, again, from my vantage point, seems like a really long time. This is before automobiles, before cars, before all kinds of things that we think of as sort of normal in the world around us today. So if we think of some of the scales of human history, we can think about a human life occupying about on average 80 years, let's say, um, or the direct contacts we have within our life. So me talking to my great grandmother when I was a kid, going back, say, 150 to 200 years in terms of the time scales that we're covering. If we look at the oldest written materials that we have evidence of, they go back about, say, 5,000 years or so, where we have written history or written textual analysis of current moments in time. And of course, we have oral traditions, stories that go back potentially even further. We have documented indigenous oral traditions that go back maybe on the scale of 10,000 years. Though obviously the certainty in that information gets cloudier the deeper back in the past that we go. But how do these scales compare to some of the major events as we think of human prehistory? Um, the origins of agriculture, the origins of domesticated life and sedentary life on the planet, the beginnings of what we think of oftentimes as human civilization, that goes back about 10,000 years ago, a little bit less than that in some parts of the globe. Um, or if we put that into generational time period, that's about 400 generations in the past. The last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, a time period where I'm sitting right now in Massachusetts would have been in the midst of a giant glacier covering much of the northern hemisphere. That's about 800 generations in the past. The origin of our species, Homo sapiens, going back sometime in the neighborhood of, let's say, 200 to 300,000 years, that's talking 10,000 generations into the past. The origins of our genus, the genus Homo, goes back sometime in the neighborhood of 1.8 to 2.8 million years. Paleoanthropologists like myself like to disagree as to when exactly that time period starts. But here we're talking like 90,000 generations in the past. The beginning of our lineage as hominins, going back to our last common ancestor with extant apes, goes back 5 to 7 million years ago, or almost a quarter of a million generations into the past. That's a huge scale of time. Earlier this week, I got this photo from a former student of mine who's currently working at a chimpanzee sanctuary in Cameroon. And the common ancestor of these two individuals, my former student and this young chimpanzee, lived about 6 million years ago in the past. And these two are separated by about 500,000 generations of evolutionary time. So what I'd like to sort of focus on is how do we as paleoanthropologists make sense of these kinds of time depths? How do we study evolutionary processes across generations that take us back thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, even millions of years into the past? The starting point also is thinking about sort of what are the evolutionary processes that we're looking at? What are the timescales upon which they act? So I usually define evolution as heritable change in a population over time. So in that, we have three different components. The notion of sort of heritability, that we're talking about variation that gets transmitted from one generation to another. Change, which is basically just referring to the presence of biological differences, variation. This is fundamentally what we're most interested in reconstructing our evolutionary past, is looking at and documenting variation and trying to come up with an understanding of what has shaped that pattern of variation. And then thinking about that across generational time period. How does that variation get passed on and change from one generation to the next across, say, those 500,000 generations that separate us from the living apes today? So how, in other words, do we go from a fossil like this fossil from Dmanisi, Dmanisi 3444, seen on the left here, going back about 1.76 million years ago, to something like what contemporary humans look like today? The image on the right is a contemporary human skull of Homo sapiens today. How do we understand the processes of change and the scales at which they operate that go from that ancient early Homo erectus ancestor to living humans today? So if we think about the processes of evolutionary change, we can talk about mutational forces. These are the primary ways in which we generate and create new forms of variation. So the spontaneous creation of new variation. Genetic drift, which is the loss of variation through random sampling from one generation to the next. Gene flow, which I'm not going to talk about too much in this talk, but the structure of variation across populations. How are populations connected to one another? How is heritable variation moving between populations? This is the evolutionary force that maintains similarity within a species. And then finally, natural selection, how we think about adaptive change in a populationship on the basis between what is that species, what is that organism, and how does it fit into its environment? So thinking about adaptive changes. Um, so we can think about, so what are the time scales on which these evolutionary processes operate? How might they be making themselves visible, or how we might use them to interpret variation in the fossil record that we see? So if we think about mutation, just to start off there, mutation generates new random variation. It sort of spontaneously from one generation to the next, if we're thinking about DNA, we get sort of a small number of changes. I probably carry, and all of you probably carry, something like 100 to 200 unique mutations that you didn't inherit from either of your parents, but that sort of spontaneously developed during that generational time. But mutation rates, generally speaking, are very slow. So I've got about 100 to 200 unique mutations out of the 3.5 billion bits of DNA that I have within my body. So by itself, mutation is very slow, but it's also, we can model it as being sort of on average very constant across time. And we can actually use that to establish relationships of how far back in the past our ancestors were on the basis of how different we are. So if we compare us to chimpanzees, for example, we're about 98% genetically identical, and we can use that in part through the molecular clock to sort of date when we expect our last common ancestor to be. Interestingly, for how we might sort of think about variation in the fossil record, is the effect of any given mutation is random. Now, most mutations are probably producing very little tangible phenotypic differences that we can see, so observable differences. But on average, we probably carry, say, 10 to 20 mutations that do produce a sort of a tangible result. And some of those results might actually contribute to the ways in which we appear different, or even the ways in which fossils are different from one another. Then we have genetic drift. Genetic drift is the random loss of variation over time as a result of sampling from finite populations. So populations exist in a set number of individuals, and they don't exactly replicate themselves from one generation to the next. So over time, we see a population like this set of sort of red and blue dots begin with sort of an even distribution of sort of two kinds of representations of that individual or that species. And over time, if we let genetic drift run its course, eventually we're going to end up with one color or another, just through the sort of process of sampling. Think of this like, if you're selectively choosing candy out of your kid's Halloween bag, eventually you're going to end up with just one kind of candy that you sort of are left with. Just like mutation, genetic drift is random in the sense that from that starting point that I identified here, it could go either direction. Over time, it's going to sort of choose one way or the other, but genetic drift leads to the loss of variation randomly over time. In terms of the pace of genetic drift can actually operate quite powerfully in the sense of when we have small populations, even little bits of sort of random sampling variation can produce pretty sizable differences. So genetic drift is something that how quickly or how powerfully it acts depends on the sizes of populations. The larger population, the less change that genetic drift will produce. The smaller population, the more change and the more rapidly it will produce change. The long-term average of genetic drift tends to be skewed towards periods of small population size. And if we look actually at human evolutionary history, up until very, very recently in our evolutionary past, human populations have been small. Humans have depended on their ability to employ technology, material culture, and social technology to extract energy and resources out of the environment. And until recently, that meant that populations were very limited in terms of how many individuals could live within a given area. Um, I post this picture here of the front page of an article from Lauren Schrader and Becky Ackerman because they, among other researchers, have pointed out that genetic drift is probably a very powerful force in human evolutionary history. That when we're interpreting the variation we see in the fossil record, a lot of what we're seeing is not necessarily adaptive differences, but rather just sort of the random fluctuations across time and space as a result of forces like genetic drift. We sometimes have a tendency to think of evolution and natural selection as if they're synonymous, as if they're the same thing. But there are other evolutionary forces like mutation and drift that are random and are sort of constantly going on in the background and helping to shape patterns of variation. In the case of human evolution, drift was probably a really significant factor shaping the variation that we observe in the fossil record. But then, of course, we also do have natural selection. Natural selection is the most complex mechanism of evolutionary change, in part because it can do lots of different things. So the direction and strength of natural selection on a population is going to be a product of the relationship between what variation exists in a population at a given time and how does that variation map onto aspects of the environment that are shaping differences in survival, differences in reproduction. And one of the reasons natural selection is complex is that it can do lots of different things. So if this gray distribution that I've illustrated here is a representation of variation in a population at a given time, one of the things that natural selection can do is maintain that variation. It can act and say, okay, basically this population is doing well right now. Any sort of outlier in either the high end or the low end is likely to cause problems, less likely to survive, less likely to reproduce. So natural selection can act to sort of maintain that current sort of centrality to that variation. And it might do so powerfully or it might do so less powerfully, allowing more or less variation at any given time. Natural selection can also produce directional change. So natural selection can shift the distribution in a feature across time in one direction or another. So, for example, one of the things that's happened in our own evolutionary past, especially over the last, let's say, 2 million years, is human brains have gotten bigger. The size of our skull has gotten larger. The size of our teeth has gotten smaller. That's been a fairly consistent directional change that's occurred throughout the last 2 million years, up until about 50,000 years ago when our brains stopped getting bigger. Natural selection can also produce diversifying change. So it can take that sort of starting point and actually advantage either end of the distribution, so cause divergence in the variation that we're looking at. So natural selection can act very powerfully. It can produce change very quickly under the right circumstances. If there's a lot of environmental change very quickly, if there's a lot of variation within a population, natural selection can produce fairly dramatic changes very quickly. We have documented evidence of this from contemporary populations where we've looked at how a population actually shifted across time in lots of organisms outside of humans. The strength of selection is going to depend, however, on that relationship between how stable is the environment, which is shaping the conditions for natural selection, and how much capacity for change does a species actually have? How much variation does it have, and how much is it able to keep generating variation? We can imagine natural selection sort of acting in a directional way, but eventually it might actually sort of eliminate all the variation in a feature, in which case natural selection can no longer do anything because it depends on there being variation that it can sort of differentiate from for it to act. So what we're most likely looking at when we're looking at natural selection is really looking at the long-term average of the effects of natural selection. Natural selection itself probably at times operates sort of too quickly for us to observe really easily in the fossil record, but what we see is sort of the long-term average of those effects. This image right here on the bottom of the page is actually an ocean core, which is giving us sort of a broad sense of changes in the global climate across the time period of hominin evolution, going back about 5.5 million years. Time periods where the world was warmer and wetter or colder and drier than it is in the present. And one of the things you'll notice is that's a very squiggly line, especially over about the last 2 million years as we've gone from periods of ice ages where there's massive glacial expansion, particularly across the northern hemisphere, and interglacial periods where the world gets warmer. Um, so natural selection is probably sort of The directionality of it has changed at various points if humans have occupied different points in time and place. Um, but it's also important to remember that in the background, genetic drift has probably always been sort of a fairly strong force, given the fact that human population size has been small until fairly recently. So one of the ways of thinking about how natural selection and genetic drift operate is that they're in some ways in tension, that the ability of natural selection to act with great force depends on its ability to sort of escape the gravitational force of genetic drift going on in the background. When populations are very small, genetic drift has a lot of gravitational force. As populations get bigger, the ability of natural selection to do its job gets a little bit easier. So, in summary, in terms of the evolutionary processes we're looking at, we can think of mutation as operating sort of constantly but slowly in the background. Genetic drift is also constant, but it's variable in terms of how powerfully it's acting. During periods of low population size, it's probably acting very powerfully and is probably the prime mover. And periods of high population size or expanding populations, it might be less significant. And the natural selection I like to describe as a temperamental toddler throughout the day, in the sense that from moment to moment, as the environment changes, what natural selection is doing, how it's shaping variation might change as well. But in general, we tend to focus on the overall average of natural selection, as well as maybe key big moments where there's significant change in a short period of time. So, how does that then map into the kind of evidence that we use to understand human evolutionary past? Fortunately, human evolution gives us lots of different lines of evidence that we can understand our past through. I'll talk about a few of them over the next couple of slides, but really the way in which these evolutionary forces map onto the evidence depends on the kind of evidence we're looking at. A fossil like the one seen on this cover of Science here, this is again a Dmanisi specimen, uh, is giving us a window into morphological variation. What did something look like? And we can put that in relationship to other kinds of fossils to look at, okay, how are the differences patterned here? What features are different? How is that variation a reflection of heritable variation that is changing over time to understand evolution? So as a starting point, I want to pull up this figure from a recent paper from Kevin Hatala, Neil Roach, and Kay Berensmeyer talking about the scales of evidence. This was a paper that was specifically looking at fossil footprint evidence. But we can see on this figure sort of these axes of time in years on a log scale, and then the geographic area we're sampling. And we can see that fossils and other kinds of evidence represent specific kinds of scales, both of time and space, that they are representing, that they are giving us a window into. And the track surfaces that they're analyzing here, this is from another recent paper from Kevin Hatala and colleagues, are really amazing kinds of fossil evidence because they give us this unique view into a specific moment in time where we're actually seeing evidence of how hominids and other organisms, how their feet and their anatomy interacted with the ground in a specific moment of time. So we're really seeing like an individual moment in an individual place. So the scale of time and the scale of space in this case is very, very small, as small as we can possibly get. Most of the time, we're looking at fossils like these. These are, again, two of the fossils from Dmanisi that are giving us really a window into the aggregate of development and life history across a lifespan. So our skeleton is amazing, and fossils of skeletal remains are amazing because they preserve a window into the lived experience of an individual. They represent aspects of development, so how the skeleton has developed, and what that skeleton, what that individual experienced throughout their life. So example, the 3444 skull here on the right, one of the things that's notable about this specimen is it's edentulous, meaning it has no teeth. And it actually lost its teeth during life. And as it lost its teeth, your body actually takes away the bone that houses those teeth. So we can actually see evidence of, in this case, the lived experience of this individual losing its teeth and then subsequently losing the bone that houses that teeth. Likewise, the 211 mandible that we see here, the lower jaw, we know to be like a late teenage individual, probably on the basis of the fact that its third molar, what we sometimes refer to as our wisdom teeth, is just beginning to enter into occlusion. So it's just reached the point where it's fully erupted and making contact with the tooth above it. And we can look at sort of the timing of development on the basis of this. So fossils represent sort of this combination of lived experience. every once in a while, they do give us a window into this snapshot moment of life. For example, how an individual might have died. This is the fossil on the right is a fossil skull of an Australopithecine from South Africa, from a site called Swartkrans. And you might notice that it has these two puncture holes in the back of it that happen to map on really nicely to fossilized leopard jaws from the same site. And what we see here is a window into this is probably how this individual died. They were ambushed by a leopard, dragged up into a tree as the leopard sort of grabbed hold of the back of the skull. Um, Fossils can also tell us about how individuals and populations interacted with their environment through things like the diet and how they moved around in the environment. So these are photos showing aspects of what we call stable isotope analysis. So actually looking at aspects of the chemical signature of teeth that tell us something about the kind of food that individuals ate. And through that, tell us about how they're interacting and moving across an environment, how they fit into an ecosystem that's sampling perhaps a slightly broader time period and a broader geological or geographic area. We can look at geological evidence itself. So we depend very heavily as paleoanthropologists on geologists to help situate us in time, to give us dates associated with the fossil and archaeological evidence that we're finding. But soils themselves can also give us time periods or evidence about sort of the stability of an environment across time. When was this an environment in which, for example, soils were able to form and persist and support the conditions upon which all the organisms around it sort of lived? So they can tell us about general processes of environmental change over time across various time scales, like the image shows here of a profile of where we see sort of two periods of major soil development in this area. Archaeological evidence is some of the most abundant evidence that we have of our presence on the planet in the past. Fortunately, for those of us who study human evolution, humans have been making and leaving trash behind for at least 3.5 million years, trash in the form of stone tools. Stone tools don't give us direct information about human biology and human biological variation, but they give us direct information about the presence of hominins in our past, where and when were humans at various points of time. Stone tools preserve a lot better than fossils, so they're maybe our most reliable indicator of when and where humans were present in the past. And they give us indirect evidence about how humans interacted with their environment, how they were able to process food, get access to food, and interact with their environment in sort of broader terms. Finally, we have genetic evidence, which these days is some of the most significant evidence that we use to reconstruct our evolutionary past. And genetic evidence, both contemporary studies of DNA in living people, but also increasingly the study of DNA extracted from ancient material, so extracted directly from fossils or even the soils in which fossils are housed, give us a really unique view because they give us a direct view into heritable variation in our DNA, but also they give us a window into how we are related to one another. So connections across time and space. Our DNA really represents this sort of combination, not just of who your parents and grandparents and great grandparents are, but who your evolutionary relatives are going back deep into evolutionary time. So genetic evidence gives us sort of this long window into how evolutionary variation has developed and accumulated and been passed on across long periods of both time and space. Um, so to put this into a little bit of context, if we think about a fossil like this is again one of the Diminuti skulls. It is telling us something about the lived experience of this individual across its lifespan, going from birth to death, mapping onto aspects of life history and development as preserved in this specimen. So it's giving us something on the scale of sort of tens of years in this case. Um, it itself is situated in a specific geological context. So for many fossil sites that we look at, they're sampling broad periods of time. So they might be sampling 10,000 years in which sort of individuals were living and dying on the surface, some of which fossilized that we then recover today. So it's coming from some period within, say, this window of time. We don't know exactly when it necessarily is from, but it's sort of sampling this broad period of time. Some geological context and some fossil context give us a narrower window of time where we can say, actually, this is sampling a much smaller scale of time, maybe on the scale of hundreds of years. There's even some fossil localities that are really giving us a specific window into a very narrow moment of time. So the geological context situates exactly where these fossils are situated within that time period. So if we look at a map like this is a map showing some of the major fossil hominin sites in the later Pleistocene. Each one of these fossils is giving us a unique window into the lived experience of a single individual. So something like a couple decades of life in all of these different geographic locations. We can supplement this fossil material with archaeological evidence that might help us fill in the gaps of at least where hominins were during this time period. So not every environment is capable of producing lots of fossils or preserves fossils very well, but archaeological evidence helps us fill in the gaps as to the kinds of environments that humans were able to fill. Genetic evidence then provides this tool to begin to connect some of these, to think about, okay, what are the broad patterns of connection going back into time, where in the present, we have a very fine scale map of that. The further back in the past we go, the sort of foggier the picture gets. When we look at studies of ancient DNA, they then allow us to actually do that same analysis, looking backwards and forwards from some time point in the past. Our current distribution of ancient DNA is heavily biased towards sort of mid and higher latitude sites in the northern hemisphere. DNA doesn't preserve as well in warm and humid environments, so we have less DNA from tropical environments like Central Africa. But nevertheless, it gives us a tool for sort of connecting these dots. So in genetic evidence oftentimes leads to sort of maps like this. This is a map from a recent publication showing time periods of these moments of connection between ancient human groups like Denisovans and Neanderthals, and where and when those might have occurred. But as we think about the geographic scale of some of this evidence, one of the things that's important to represent is that we oftentimes see these maps that show arrows depicting, the movement of ancient humans in the past. Um, that's not the movement of, say, getting up and deciding you're going to drive your car, on vacation. That we're looking at the accumulation of the presence of populations across long periods of time. So sort of thinking about movement, not so much as getting up and relocating, but rather the gradual change in the geographic distribution of fossils over time. And fossil localities themselves may be sampling across lots of different time intervals as we see these populations sampled. So it's always helpful to remind yourself when you see those maps with arrows, that those arrows are really complex representations of the history of populations across time and space. So to step back and sort of wrap up before we go into the Q&A, well, first of all, I like Impressionist paintings. That's just a bias that I have. And I particularly like this painting. That might just be a reflection of the fact that as a kid, I watched Ferris Bueller's Day Off lots of times. And this painting is featured in that movie. But if we think of this painting as metaphorically representing the rich history of humans on the planet, going back, say, 5 to 7 million years, the sort of fine details and events and populations that existed and changed across all the different environments that humans have occupied. If we go back, say, 200 years ago, right at the beginning of when we began to formally study the human fossil record, our understanding of the ancient past probably looked more like this. We had some broad sense of, there were big old things a long time ago, and then things changed, and then things became more like us. But it was a very, very superficial understanding of the past that just sort of put the broad outlines in context. As we began studying the fossil record, each one of those fossils, every fossil and every locality gives us this little window into that complex picture of the past. As we've gotten more systematic and better and done more of this work, we've identified localities that give us like really rich windows into the past. So places like the Hadar region in Ethiopia or the Lake Turkana Basin in Kenya, where we have got lots of different fossil localities across time that give us the ability to understand the environment that humans were occupying in rich detail. Places like Dmanisi, where we have the combination of archaeological and fossil and faunal evidence all together. As we begin to sort of increase our understanding and analyses of that, we can begin to sort of connect some of these areas and create more of the picture. As we use archaeology to help sort of fill in some of these gaps in our understanding of the environment and geology, we can further clarify that picture. Genetics gives us this tool for connecting all of these and thinking about processes of selection and change over time. And even as we begin to sort of interrogate some of our own initial biases and how we understand that past, the picture becomes clearer. So that we don't have a perfect understanding of the past, and we never will have a perfect understanding of the ancient past. But by combining these different bits of evidence and thinking about how they're telling us about specific times and places and the variation we're seeing and the processes that are likely shaping them, we've created a pretty good picture of what human evolutionary past looked like. There's still new fossils that produce sort of surprising evidence that adds detail into a part of the picture that we don't yet have clarity on. So when we see those, newspaper headlines that say, new fossil rewrites history, there's some of that is true in the sense that we can find details that weren't observable before, but also it's just adding clarity to a picture that we've studied and understood for a long time. I will stop there and open it to your questions, but thank you so much for taking the time today, and I'm very curious to hear what you want to know more about.
That was fantastic. Thank you. And my mind is already like, we have some behind the scenes questions going as well. So actually, our first audience question is from Jean, who says, "Hello, this is amazing. I'm wondering if you could recommend a book or two on this topic so I can read in more depth than this short presentation could possibly go."
I have a number of books that I can recommend. Um, Too many for me to probably give you details right now. Is it possible for me, Brianna, to send those recommendations to you and they can go into like show notes or something like that?
Yes, that would be perfect. I think we'll send out an email to everybody who is registered and we can include those book recommendations. That would be excellent.
So thank
Thank
you,
you.
Gene. I will definitely send a number of recommendations because there's a lot of actually really great books right now. In the last couple of years, I feel like there's been a lot of great books on human evolution that have come out.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to get to another one of our behind the scenes question. Okay, this is my question. My question is, it's actually my question and Ryan's question combined. So how can we tease out whether features or adaptations in our evolutionary history are the result of natural selection or genetic drift? And PS, does that distinction even matter?
Um, that's a
Small
great
question.
question. I'm going to start with the latter part first, which is does it
Okay.
matter? I think it does matter. It matters,
Mm-hmm.
I think, in terms of whether we think of what we're seeing as a reflection of adaptive processes,
Mm-hmm.
the result of natural selection, or the result of sort of neutral processes.
Mm-hmm.
One reason it matters is because we tend to give different weight to those two categories. There's a
Mm-hmm.
tendency, one of the reasons we understand or try and understand the evolutionary past of humans is to better understand the present.
Mm-hmm.
What are conditions that affect human health and survival today? Um, and part of that is understanding sort of what's just sort of normal variation in the background that's not really doing much, and what's variation that might be sort of subject to natural selection. So, for example, just
Mm-hmm.
as sort of one example of that, we can think about one of the sort of global public health crises that we face today is pretty dramatic increases over the last 50 years in rates of metabolic disorders like diabetes. And so part of that is understanding, how does that reflect sort of how are we fitting into our environment, but also how can we identify elements, for example, of DNA that might be associated with that increase. So I think there's important reasons to differentiate natural selection and the neutral evolutionary forces like mutation and drift. How we do so is more complicated. Um, DNA gives us pretty direct lines. There are sort of direct tools in terms of how we would expect to see change that reflects natural selection versus genetic drift. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Fossils, it becomes a little bit more challenging because we're one step removed. We have to infer, okay, how is heritable variation shaping the variation that we're seeing in fossils?
Mm-hmm.
Here again, we can essentially propose hypotheses as to whether or not features are the result of selective forces and adaptive processes or whether they're neutral. The sort of patterns of change that we see. So there are certain patterns, for example, if we're seeing consistent maintenance of certain kinds of features, that's pretty
Mm-hmm.
strong evidence that that's natural selection maintaining that similarity over time, the first example that we saw. When we
Mm-hmm.
see consistent directional change across time, that's pretty good evidence of natural selection because forces like mutation and drift are random. We don't expect them to
Mm-hmm.
be sort of consistently directional across time. But where there's features that we don't have obvious sort of an understanding of, oh, that's obviously affecting how an organism is fitting into its environment, so it doesn't seem to have any sort of functional significance, or when the variation is just sort of random, then that's a
Mm-hmm.
good sign that that's probably not an adaptive process. Again, there's been a tendency to view every feature as if it's
Yes.
solely the result of natural selection, and that's
Mm-hmm.
probably not a good model, especially for human evolution.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's always helpful for us to keep in mind, even as scientists and researchers. Here's a great question from Steve, who asks, given the fragmented fossil record and lack of complete specimens for hominins, how do you definitively define species and determine species boundaries? Also another small question, big question.
You were probably asking the wrong person that, because I am, so in paleoanthropology, we oftentimes sort of talk about splitters versus lumpers. So
hmm
people who tend to identify and name lots of different species and people who
hmm
tend to identify fewer species.
hmm
I'm probably on the fairly extreme end of the lumper, so I'm
Yeah.
less concerned with species. Species are an important thing. I mean, one of the things that I say whenever I teach my classes is I do believe that species are a fundamental unit of biology. And
hmm
here I'm going to limit myself to mammals because there's some weird, wacky things in the biological world where species get even more complex. But if we're thinking about things like us, I think species are a real thing, meaning they are
hmm
created by evolution itself. They're not
Okay.
simply a product of how we have tried to understand evolution. And
hmm
so, as such, I think they structure how these forces are operating. But they're also very complicated. I mean, part of what's come out of our understanding of ancient DNA, for example, is if we go back to that map that I showed a few slides back, we know that we interacted with Neanderthals and Denisovans and probably other extinct groups of humans that were considerably more different than the two most different populations on the planet today that many paleoanthropologists would identify as a different species altogether. And yet they were able to come together and interact. If we think of the time scale of human evolution, it's really not a lot of evolutionary time.
hmm
So the amount of, even if we do identify lots of species, those species were probably interacting in really complex kinds of ways. Um, so the whole notion of species is complex. But to get back to the original question, part of how, so the amount of evolutionary information in every given fossil is going to be different. As the question sort of alluded to, some fossils are small, fragmentary material that by themselves don't necessarily tell a lot. They have to be put
hmm
in sort of conversation with lots of other fossils to get a better sense of variation. Some fossils, like partial skeletal remains, where we've got, not just an isolated fragment of an individual, but lots of different individuals, allow us to reconstruct the biology of that individual to a much greater degree. So sites like Dmanisi, where we have not just multiple well-preserved skulls, but we also have the postcranial evidence for them, and we have younger individuals, older individuals, probably biological male individuals, biological female individuals, allow us to reconstruct kind of what does normal variation look like at a
hmm
small temporal and geographic scale that allow us to think about, okay, well, how does that variation map onto contemporary kinds of species? So we can use contemporary species this is a model for beginning to differentiate some of that variation. But the overall variation that we're looking at, again, is this sort of complex mosaic of individuals across time and space. So it's a fun problem to engage with, but it's a complicated one.
Yeah, that's fair. So this question sort of links back a little bit to something you said in answer to the first question. Because you mentioned about sort of like that we should remember about that all features we see are not adaptive in our evolutionary history. So Sloka asks, how, in parentheses, or does this research relate to the thought of human exceptionalism?
That's a great question too. Um, And also something that I address a lot when I'm teaching my introductory classes.
Mhm,
So in some ways, I mean, part of the reason why also we might think about genetic drift and these other sort of neutral forces is we're not necessarily exceptional in the sense that, going back to that image of my former student and the chimpanzee that she was holding there, um, we are equally evolved from our last common ancestor 5 to 7 million years ago.
mhm,
We have a tendency to see evolution in sort of linear and progressive terms that we've just gotten better and we were like the inevitable result of all of this,
mhm,
and that's definitely not the case. There's all kinds of ways in which evolution could have gone differently. On the other hand, we are a little bit exceptional. The fact that we are able to have a virtual webinar with people across the globe, maybe at the moment, is something that no other species on the planet is doing. Um, and the specific details of human evolutionary history um,
mhm,
are unique. And they have set us up to be a really weird species in lots of ways. That
mhm,
might go back to the beginnings of bipedalism at the beginning of the hominid lineage 5 to 7 million years ago. I
mhm,
usually sort of put the sort of critical junction as something like the beginning of Homo erectus. Now, immediately, I'm biased by this because that is a lot of my research. But this
Mm-hmm.
notion where humans became fundamentally dependent on technology. And by technology, I mean both social technology and material technology. So not just the stone tools, but the individuals, the learning, the structures that make those tools possible. That
Mm-hmm.
really set us on a unique trajectory. It allowed us to begin evolving as a species in ways where we were not dependent on mutation producing random change that happened to be beneficial, that happened to allow us to sort of adjust to changing conditions, and instead allowed us to behaviorally, even symbolically, adapt and adjust to changing conditions. So it set us up for sort of not to be unique, but to allow evolution to operate on humans in fairly unique kinds of ways that we don't observe in many other species.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Andy asks, can you repeat or explain again how natural selection can eliminate variation?
So natural selection is thinking about sort of, again, differential survival and reproduction. And it
Mm-hmm.
basically, if I could do one thing different, if I could go back in prehistory and just do something minor, I would try and go back to prehistory to meet Charles Darwin because that would be really cool. But also I would
Mm-hmm.
try and encourage him to not name this evolutionary process that he describes as natural selection. Natural selection makes it sound like it's an active agent in choosing sort of winners and
Mm,
losers. Whereas what natural selection really does is some individuals survive better, produce more offspring, and therefore the features that they have, the heritable features they have, are more
mm,
common in the next generation. So one of the ways that
mm-hmm.
natural selection eliminates variation is just some individuals produce more offspring so that down the line, features that they carried are more common in an environment. Selection
Mm-hmm.
sometimes also acts directly, and sort of some individuals might be sort of more prone to dying and therefore be sort of selected against in that way, in the sense that they don't survive to reach the age of reproduction, and therefore like variation that they carry might be sort of eliminated in that context.
Mm-hmm.
So selection acts both sort of directly in terms of some individuals live and some individuals don't live, but then also indirectly in terms of the changing frequency over time, and as such eliminates variation that way.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question about some of the research that you've done in Georgia. So Jay asks, what are the cultural beliefs or feelings around active archaeology happening in Georgia?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just like any place, there's lots of different views. So I was doing my fieldwork in Georgia mainly between 2002 and 2014. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that struck me early on in my time period there was actually how much the population knew about what we were doing. Demonacy was fairly prominent.
Mm-hmm.
It got a lot of media attention back in the day. We would every field season have local news crews who would come meet with us, and even just because it's sort of a significant cultural site, people would just visit the site on a regular basis, and they would know like about the fossils that we were
Hmm.
talking about. They'd be able to identify them. There was even sort of in Tbilisi, you could find like street graffiti of the fossils themselves. They had
Cool.
names. In meeting with like students in Georgia, they would oftentimes, when they were taking English lessons, write about Dmanisi as like part of their assignments. So students oftentimes knew a lot about it. Georgia was a fairly young nation at that point, having, emerged out of the post-Soviet world in the early 1990s and gone through its own sort of turmoil and challenges in the 1990s. And Dmanisi became sort of a pretty significant cultural touchstone within the country in terms of its prominence in the world, its significance in the world, its presence as a site of significant cultural and historical significance for humans. So
That's really fascinating.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So Richard asks, he says the map of population expansion over time seem to indicate that Western European genus Homo is derived from Northwestern Africa, while Asian genus Homo or hominins are derived from East Africa and Ethiopia. Can you confirm or expand on this? He says, I thought there was greater admixture.
So there's definitely a lot of admixture, and that might I'd have to go back and look at the details of that picture again. But one of the reasons where there can be connections between North Africa and Western Europe is that the Strait of Gibraltar is not very big, and there's
Hmm.
some thinking that at various times in the past there might have been connections, biogeographic connections between the Iberian Peninsula and Northwest Africa. The
Hmm.
ecological zones of the Iberian Peninsula are actually in some ways map on quite similarity or quite similarly to Northwest Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if we think about Eastern and sort of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, um, there's a sort of also sort of a broad East-West similarity there. And the sort of
Mm-hmm.
most common way in which we think of dispersal of hominins out of Africa is through the Arabian Peninsula, through the Near East, and then
Mm-hmm.
dispersing east and west from there. So
Mm-hmm.
there's complex, connections across time. If we look
Mm-hmm.
at the European genetic history of contemporary Europeans, it isn't just it's not just modern humans arrived there 35,000 years ago and that's it. Those early anatomically modern humans, they got subsequently largely replaced by later humans and even later humans and later humans and later humans. So all of those maps that show those arrows are really, again, these sort of palimpsests of lots of different events that are oftentimes more complex than a simple arrow allows us to represent.
Yeah, thank you. Like you said, those maps are very much simplified and sort of indicate, just populations going in one direction or something like that. Um, so this is one of our behind the scenes questions. Could you speak more about the sampling error that results from time averaging, geographic averaging, even natural selection averaging, as you alluded to? How is this a limitation to the research questions you're interested in? Or how could these averages actually be helpful to us in understanding the deep past?
That's a great question. And it's a real challenge. And it's one of the ways in which we really have to rely heavily on our geologist colleagues in terms of dating. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in places where Dr. Pobiner works, for example, in East Africa, we're oftentimes dealing with uh, sites where the exact geological date is a little uncertain, or there's perhaps a
Mm-hmm.
broad time period. And one of the challenges that you might sort of imagine in this context, if we have two fossils from any given locality, it's possible that they're contemporaneous. So they're representing what does variation look like at one time. But it's also
Mm-hmm.
possible that they're 10,000 or 20,000 years separate in time, in which
Mm-hmm.
case there's a lot of possibility for change across 20,000 year time period. So that
Mm-hmm.
becomes a real challenge to go back to one of the earlier questions also in terms of like how we identify species differences. Because when we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about variation across time, part of that means knowing, a lot about what is that time difference, how much
Mm-hmm.
variation is present at one time. If those two individuals that I mentioned a moment ago are at the same time, then that much variation is present. If they're separated by some time period, then maybe that's just change across time, or maybe it's just incomplete sampling. So
Mm-hmm.
the more fossils we have, the better we're able to differentiate those, the better we're able to sort of have a window into what that variation looks like. The presence
Mm-hmm.
also of certain localities where we do have lots of individuals who we know are coming from the same time helps us with this. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons that I really one of my biases, I would say, is that having worked at Dmanisi for so long, it is a site that we think all the fossils are coming from a very narrow window of time. And there are a lot of fossils that are giving us, this picture of what natural variation looks like. And it gives us
Mm-hmm.
an interesting then window to look at other kind of localities where we have different kinds of geological sampling. So for me, it gives me a window to look at the very rich East African fossil record of the same time period where we got lots and lots of fossils, but they all have some uncertainty in terms of where they're coming from, and think about, well, if we use Dmanisi as the window for what does normal variation look like at this time period, how does that
Mm-hmm.
map onto what we're seeing in East Africa, where some of these dates are more uncertain in terms of where fossils are located?
Awesome. Thank you. So we'll continue a little bit on the species theme. So Jeannie asked another question about species. Aren't we doing the typical human thing of creating boxes or categories on something that's really a continuum without true divisions?
That is a great question. And again, it goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, where yes, we are doing that, definitely. We kind of have to
Hmm.
do that. We can't
Yeah.
understand the world around us without creating boxes. But I do
Hmm.
think in the case of mammals, species are a real thing. But they're a real
Hmm.
thing where the boundary of that box is not a fixed thing. So
Mm.
species are not static, they're dynamic and they do change over time. And the
Hmm.
connections between them are porous. So they're
Mm.
not as clearly delineated as this is the separation between one species and another. And one way to think about this is through the process of speciation itself. So
Hmm.
speciation, so I've got kids. The images you saw of the temperamental toddler, that was my youngest, who's actually just turned 12 yesterday. So those are old pictures. And for those of us who are parents, we might think our kids are truly a different species than us because we don't always understand them. But that is not how new species form. New species occur across long, long, long periods of time. And during those
Mm.
periods where populations are becoming different from one another. They're not quite different species yet, but maybe they're becoming different species, but that endpoint
Mm-hmm.
isn't yet determined. So one way of thinking about species is they are real, uh, something created by evolution itself, but we are limited in how we talk about them. That the way
Mm-hmm.
that we construct them as concepts makes them a fixed category as opposed to the dynamic category that they really are. But I
Mm-hmm.
do truly think that they are a real thing,
Mm-hmm.
not solely a product of how we talk about them. But we always have to be mindful that when we do talk about them, we are reducing them to something that is malleable and that works for our purposes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that we can talk with each other about, yeah,
Yeah.
about what these species. So here's another fun behind the scenes question. Which fossil or genetic find do you think has been the most pivotal to changing our perspective on human evolution? And also, which field, fossils, archaeology, genetics, proteomics, has the most potential for major shifts in our thinking?
Those are great questions. I'm going to start with the second one
Yep.
first again.
Mm-hmm.
I think paleoproteomics is really, really
Yeah.
cool. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Me too.
DNA is great, but DNA is a complex molecule that doesn't preserve super well, whereas there's
Mm-hmm.
lots of different kinds of proteins, some of which can be preserved across really long, long, long periods of time. Um, so I think proteomics has the chance to really do a lot of interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
The complication is that there are lots and lots and lots of different kinds of proteins, and protein structures are quite variable. So there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
work we need to do to better understand proteins today to really fully do that in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if there's one fossil that I think is the coolest, at least over like say the last like decade or two, um, I have to go with the most surprising fossil possible, which is a tiny fossil from the cave site of Denisova in southwestern Siberia. That's just a little fragment of a long bone. It's the kind of fossil that if you're working at fossil localities, just gets thrown into a bag, maybe gets measured
Yeah.
and weighed and labeled, but it is by itself not preserving really any anatomical information to tell us even that it's a hominin fossil. It's just a fragment of a long bone. And in this case, this particular one, Denisova 11, is about the size of my pinky nail. So tiny
Mm-hmm.
little fragment, like a centimeter long. But a graduate student at the Max Planck Institute doing her thesis work, Sam Brown, was
Mm-hmm.
actually doing some of that sort of paleoproteomics, looking at collagen, collagen is the
Mm-hmm.
primary protein that makes up skeletal material. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and collagen differs across different groups of mammals. So if you can identify collagen, you can identify, say, this is a primate or this is some other kind of mammal. And this particular fossil, she did this on several thousand fossil fragments. This one came back as primate. And the only primate present in southwestern Siberia at the time period of Denisova, let's say 80,000 years ago, were hominins of some kind. So it was an indication that it was a hominin. And because it had collagen, that meant it had some preserved organic material. And because it was a hominin, they're like, well, let's see if there's DNA. And indeed, there was very high quality DNA in this individual. And it turned out that this individual was the child, first generation child of a Neanderthal and a Denisovan, two
Mm-hmm.
extinct human groups that are more different than the two most different people on the planet today by an order of magnitude. They were
Mm-hmm.
probably sort of divergent across 500,000 years. And yet, at some point in time, they came together and produced a kid. And we actually found a fossil that tells us that comes from that kid.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is an amazing and surprising window into the nature of evolutionary processes in our own past. That even
Mm-hmm.
across really huge separation, actually, that capability of producing offspring was still very much there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and again, the kind of fossil that would have been a fragment that would just gotten thrown into a bag and labeled and ignored, except that it happened to have this incredibly rich genetic and evidence.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful story. And actually, for folks who are interested, Sam Brown did one of our Hot Topic programs and talked about this a little bit. So you can look back on our YouTube channel with all of our Hot Topic playlist if you want to learn more about this wonderful story. All right, we have time for two more questions. The first one is from Roger, and this follows really well on what you were just talking about. Given environmental DNA and proteomics, should archaeologists have never washed their finds?
Uh, yes and no. There's a lot of really
Yeah.
good things that come from washing finds. Like we need to wash sediment to get access to certain kind of things, especially as we get sort of later in time period. The
Mm-hmm.
preservation of like plant materials, like we need to separate those in ways.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely there's value in preserving as much information as possible and
Mm-hmm.
making it possible so that as science develops, there's still material to go back and ask questions of.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we shouldn't do is when we put fossils on display, for example, we shouldn't have cleaned their teeth ahead of time. It's nice
Yeah.
to have nice clean teeth on a fossil, but actually it turns out that plaque that builds up on the teeth, it contains microscopic particles of the kinds of food that organisms ate, maybe even some of the
Mm-hmm.
DNA. So there is value in maintaining information as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
The process of discovery itself is itself destructive. So we want to be sort of
Mm.
mindful of limiting how much destruction we produce in the past so that it's still available to us in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, last question, and this is on a slightly different topic. So Jay asks, can you talk more about your work with updating curricula in schools?
Yeah. So Massachusetts, constantly is updating sort of curriculum. And in this case, there's actually sort of a continuous fourth, fifth, and sixth grade curriculum on the ancient past. That starts off with like thinking like an archaeologist and eventually moves into, a little bit on the sort of deep history of humans as a species, but then goes into like the rise of civilizations and agriculture and that kind of stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I've just been working with but basically, this company, this nonprofit, basically secured the state grant to reevaluate the curriculum. They sort of established this new set of goals, and I've been working with them as one of the sort of specialists in the field to be a resource in terms of shaping the content to make sure it's accurate, but also as a
Mm-hmm.
resource for teachers themselves and educators to learn how to talk about this because this is
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes these are topics that educators and teachers don't necessarily have a lot of direct experience with. So
Mm-hmm.
that direct, immediate conversations can be really valuable just in empowering teachers to feel comfortable talking about these kinds of things. And one of the fun things about it is it's really sort of reshaped it instead of thinking about the ancient past as like we're just trying to figure out the label in the museum to put on these things.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about the ancient past as a time period to understand change and variation and how that again maps on to the present, in which we see lots of change and variation around us.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Exciting. So we're going to wrap up. This concludes today's virtual program. Please join me in thanking Adam for sharing his work with us. I'd also like to give special thanks to those who made this program possible, to our behind the scenes team who helped sort through your questions, including Dr. Ryan McRae, who worked with us in the Human Origins program, to our donors, volunteers, and viewers like you, and finally to all our partners who help us reach, educate, and empower millions of people around the world today and every day. We thank you. Next month on April 17th, we're going to be hosting Dr. Emma Finestone, who will be talking about the earliest origins of stone tool technology. So please join us for our next hot topic program installation. We've put a link in the Q&A where you can find more information about our upcoming programs and how to sign up for the museum's weekly e-newsletter. That's the best way to stay informed on upcoming programs and learn more about the museum's research and exhibits. After this webinar ends, you'll see a survey pop up asking for some feedback about the program. Please take a moment to respond. We're very curious to know what topics you might be interested in seeing for future programs, and we appreciate your input. Again, thank you to Adam, and thank you to the audience, and we'll see you next month.